And just to recap a little bit, Jews were a very small percentage of the American population, probably 1/10 of 1%. And remember, the American population is very small, so Jews are not that involved in American life, and those that are generally from a more Sephardic background. There are, however, a few who do achieve some prominence. Chaim Solomon being the most notable. But that starts to change really in the middle of the 18th century. So who comes after Jefferson but James Madison? So James Madison is quite an important president, different than Jefferson, but quite influential, quite very much on the same page with Jefferson as it came to separation of church and state. And that meant that the same kind of protections, or at least tolerance for Jews that really flourished under Jefferson, really continued with Madison. Madison was probably was quite similar to Jefferson in being a deist, really doubting the existence of any kind of supernatural God. And were very much, in fact, Madison, one interesting thing I learned while researching James Madison is that he opposed the appointment of a chaplain for Congress, right? There's still a chaplain today. There's a congressional chaplain. It's a paid position, and occasionally guest chaplains will come and offer a blessing. I got offered that once, and I couldn't do it for whatever reason, but they'll have different rabbis, imams, ministers who come. It's generally empty, like no one's really there, but you get this honorific that you can appear as giving an opening blessing. But James Madison opposed the existence of a chaplain at all, saying that it's too much of a crossing the line between church and state. Perhaps there really weren't major Jewish events during Madison's presidency, but there is the emergence, really prominent in public life for the first time, of two Jews. One of them is named Mordechai Manuel Noah. Now, Mordechai Manuel Noah is such an interesting figure in American Jewish life. He was a democratic sort of political operative, if you want to think of it. He was a political operative living in New York who was kind of always making ruckus. He was a kind of an activist, and he actually wanted to create a Jewish state in upstate New York, a republic with its own laws, and a self-governing entity, essentially create a new Zion. And he believed that if it were to be set up, that Jews from Europe would come and immigrate there. And he actually had a whole opening ceremony with great fanfare, but then no one showed up. No one came. People just kept coming to America. But he stayed on it for a long time. But then he founded a magazine, and he would continue to write. And he would write letters to the president, and presidents would usually respond. He would write op-eds about different issues. And he was kind of, in some ways, the Jewish voice of America. But he was very prickly. If the president didn't respond to his letter or treated him badly, he would write op-eds about it. And in fact, quite interestingly, James Madison appointed Mordechai Noah to be the consul general in Turkey in 1811. However, soon enough, they realized that's probably not a good idea to have a Jewish, essentially, ambassador to a Muslim country. So they rescinded the appointment. In fact, the Secretary of State, James Monroe, rescinded Mordechai Noah's appointment as the consul in Turkey. And Mordechai Noah was very upset about it and wrote lots of op-eds and campaigned against James Madison in the next election. So that's kind of interesting. The other kind of prominent Jew of the time, who also remained prominent really for the next 50 years. He died shortly after the Civil War, was someone named Uriah Philip Levy. Now, Uriah Philip, another very interesting Jew. He was born in Philadelphia, which, again, as we talked about last week, was one of the 4 major Jewish communities. Came from a Sephardic family that immigrated from England. And according to legend, he left home at age 10 to go out to sea. At 10, it's kind of young, but he went out to sea, and his parents gave up on finding him, but he came back for his bar mitzvah. It seems a little odd, but he did have a bar mitzvah at Mikveh Israel Synagogue in Philadelphia, which still exists. It's beautiful, tiny little synagogue. And then Uriah Levy joined the Navy, and he was court-martialed many times because he would strike back against anti-Semitic comments. He opposed flogging, which was an accepted practice in the Navy at that time. He said it was inhumane, and people would criticize him as disrupting naval tradition by saying we shouldn't flog, but he would keep criticizing it. He was a very, very kind of man of strong integrity. He was ultimately pushed out of the Navy because he got in a duel with somebody who started dancing with his date at a at a naval dance. This is all true. This is quite interesting. So he got pushed out of the Navy, and then he got involved in real estate, and he made a fortune in real estate. And then he started giving to Jewish causes and other causes, and then he was ultimately reinstated back into the Navy. And he was obsessed with Thomas Jefferson, and he purchased Monticello when Jefferson died, because Jefferson was in huge debt when he died. So Uriah Phillips Levy purchased Monticello from the estate when Jefferson died with all the money he had made in real estate. And then in 1923, a great nephew of Uriah Levy, who was sort of his only living heir, donated Monticello back to the Thomas Jefferson Foundation. And that's how, this whole, it's such an interesting story. But Uriah Philip Levy was involved in every administration all the way through Lincoln. Lincoln, according to lore, at age 69, Uriah Levy wanted to go out on a boat during or get involved in some way in the Civil War. And Lincoln said, sorry, you're a little too old. But he sort of started coming to prominence during the presidency of James Madison. Now, James Monroe, also relatively uneventful time in Jewish life. But again, Mordechai Noah was a prominent Jew who would constantly comment and be involved in the administration. Again, Uriah Phillips Levy. These were sort of the most prominent Jews of the time. So remember, there's a very small Jewish community. Generally, the presidency of James Monroe was a pretty good time in American history. It was pretty stable, pretty good, no major events. Now, the next president, John Quincy Adams, we've all heard of John Quincy Adams, first time the son of a president became president. Quincy Adams was not a very popular president. And it was very interesting. I actually didn't know this. I found it in researching it. So John Quincy Adams, well, we know it was a very contested election with Andrew Jackson in 1824. Andrew Jackson won the popular vote, but John Quincy Adams won in the Electoral College. Sound familiar? This happens. And Andrew Jackson believed that John Quincy Adams, did favors, paid people off so that he would win, that the election was rigged and that he would become president. And Andrew Jackson, so John Quincy Adams becomes president, Andrew Jackson runs again against him in 1828, and Andrew Jackson wins by a lot. And John Quincy Adams is so angry that John Quincy Adams does not appear at Andrew Jackson's inauguration ceremony. I had thought that when Trump didn't go to Biden's inauguration, that was the first time. I was wrong. The first time was John Quincy Adams did not appear at Andrew Jackson's inauguration. Interestingly, Quincy Adams was much more religious than the previous presidents. He was a churchgoer, which none of the early presidents were churchgoers. They all belonged to a church, but they never went. John Quincy Adams was a regular churchgoer, and he had a cousin named Hannah Adams who wrote a book called History of the Jews and promoted conversion of Jews, which is kind of interesting. So Quincy Adams, probably a little bit more of a traditional Christian in some ways than earlier presidents, although he never promoted this kind of conversion, but he had people in his family who did. What started to happen when Quincy Adams was president was that the first small but growing wave of Jews from Germany began to come to the United States, or even just Central Europe eventually. You know, most German Jews immigrated in the 1830s and the 1840s, but really starting in 1824, you began, it was when Napoleon lost at Waterloo and kind of that stopped the, Napoleon was bringing liberal ideas to Europe. In many ways, Napoleon was bringing the ideals of the French Revolution across Europe. But when he lost, some of the conservative forces were strengthened again. And so Jews began to say, we may not have much of a future in Europe if Europe is not going to liberalize like France did, Central Europe. So you begin to get the first trickle of German Jewish immigrants, which ultimately becomes a big community. I mean, not big compared to today, but big in much bigger than the earlier Sephardic population had been. Quincy Adams is ultimately elected to Congress after he was president, which is kind of, you don't see much of that today, but he was a congressman for about 40 years. He was succeeded, as I mentioned earlier, by Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson is considered quite an important president. Not an admirable character by many means, but influential in that he was sort of the first kind of populist president. The previous presidents were all sort of they came from that, you might want to say, these sort of elites. They were the Federalists, or usually associated with the Federalists. They were descended from British sort of aristocracy who had come to the United States, not aristocracy, but British upper class. And Andrew Jackson is the first who's just a war general. He did not have much contact with Jews, very little, in fact, but he promoted Uriah Levy. He allowed him back into the Navy and promoted him. And he was quite close. What made Andrew Jackson famous was the Battle of New Orleans. You probably know that already, the Battle of New Orleans, where he defended New Orleans. And there is speculation that he got intelligence about British operations from a pirate and smuggler named Jean Lafitte. Jean Lafitte was a descendant of Sephardic Jews who practiced Judaism in secret. He was a converso and was very sympathetic to the United States. Andrew Jackson wrote very much about how much he appreciated Jean Lafitte. So that was kind of his. He was not particularly close, did not have many close Jewish contacts, but was not particularly anti-Semitic either. There really haven't been. I mean, John Quincy Adams had a little bit of tendency towards conversion of Jews, but you don't see much anti-Semitism at all. Now, who comes next? Anyone know who follows Andrew Jackson as president? Yeah.
Van Buren.
Yes, Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren. So Martin Van Buren, as in the Van Buren Street, downtown Chicago. Martin Van Buren, kind of not the most consequential president. He's kind of like George H.W. Bush. He followed a very popular president and was not nearly as charismatic. H.W. Bush follows Reagan. And so Martin Van Buren follows Jackson. And, he doesn't achieve much. He's actually quite pro-slavery, which is sort of a blot on his record. But interestingly, one of the earliest acts of global anti-Semitism happened during his presidency. It doesn't happen in America. It happens in Syria, in Damascus. I actually wrote a whole thing about this in my book on anti-Semitism. This was a priest was killed in the Jewish quarter of Damascus, and he was killed. It was a Franciscan priest, and he was killed by people on the street. But somehow other monks, other priests in that area started a rumor that it was Jews who killed him. And there was essentially a pogrom in the Jewish quarter of Damascus. And Jews were, a Jewish barber was forced to confess, along with a group of very notable, prominent Jews. And they were murdered. I think 7 people were murdered and tortured. And this ultimately led to the creation of the first kind of global Jewish organization called the Alliance Israelite Alliance, can't pronounce it in French, which was founded in Paris to advocate for their release. Because some of the people who confessed were killed, others were held in prison, and ultimately Van Buren helped secure their release. Ultimately, they were nine of the people who were held prisoner were exonerated and released. And Van Buren was supportive of that. But other than that, not much Jewish activity. Questions so far? I thought it would be good to sort of cover this chronologically so we really get each president. Any questions? Again, this is still a very small Jewish population in the United States. William Henry Harrison follows Van Buren. Harrison was only president for 31 days. You know why? Because he gave the longest inaugural address in history, an hour and a half in the freezing cold without wearing a jacket. And then he rode on a horse without a jacket during the inauguration parade. And he was already 68 years old when he became president. And so 31 days later, he died. And scholars speculate that he caught something on this. He wasn't protecting himself enough. Not much, again, only 31 days, so not much of a chance to really have a kind of impact. But, he was actually the first president that was eulogized in a published form by the Jewish community. Even today, when John F. Kennedy died, there was eulogies that are published. This is at least the first known eulogy of a president was delivered and published, was delivered by Isaac Leeser, who was an Orthodox rabbi in Philadelphia, and published commemoration of the life and death of William Henry Harrison. Okay. Now, next president is John Tyler, 1841 to 1845. Now, it's during Tyler's presidency that the Jewish population is increasing pretty significantly with the migration of Jews from Germany. However, this is also the period when a lot of the descendants of the original Sephardic Jews are basically converting or leaving the Jewish community. So this often happens, multiple generations. So here's what one scholar says. In the 1840s, when the terms Jew and to Jew found their way into common vocabulary, which is interesting, many Jews were growing uncomfortable being part of a despised minority. So anti-Semitism in Europe is really increasing at this time too. It is estimated that about 1/3 of the grandchildren of Jews who lived during the American Revolution, that's roughly 1,300 to 1,500 people, according to the first United States federal census conducted in 1790, began abandoning their faith at this time. President John Tyler's message to Congress in 1841, in which he encouraged immigration to the United States, may have been a factor in stemming the tide of assimilation, for it portrayed immigrants as valuable contributors to American life. And even in 1841, Tyler gave another speech in which he said, the Hebrew. So this is, by the way, a time period when many Jews prefer to use the term Hebrew rather than Jewish. My grandfather one time said that occasionally he would put the phrase Hebrew when people asked your religion, like at the doctor's office, they used to ask your religious affiliation, he would write Hebrew. And you notice the name of the rabbinical school founded in the 1870s, Hebrew Union College, the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. So in some ways, the term Jew had more negative implications than the term Hebrew. Now, that's essentially a discussion for another time, doesn't really anymore. But here John Tyler said, the Hebrew, persecuted and downtrodden in other regions, takes up his abode among us with none to make him afraid. He may boast as well he can of his descent from the patriarchs of old, of his wise men in council and strong men in battle. He may even turn his eye to Judea, resting with strong confidence on the promise that is made him of his restoration to the Holy Land, that he may worship the God of his fathers. That's quite interesting. So he's encouraging immigration of Jews. Yes, Evie.
Yeah. I remember for the short time that we lived in Hyde Park when I was a little girl, there was a Southside Hebrew congregation.
Yes.
Yes.
I don't remember too much more about that. But the other question that I had was, I made myself a little chart because I am history challenged, shall we say. And I noticed that Henry Harrison was the first Whig. Do we have any information about, and also Tyler, any information about where Jews fell on the political party back then?
Not much. In general, most were Democrats until Lincoln, in which they became Republicans. But the Democrats were the more, generally the more immigrant-friendly political party of the time. And most Jews were immigrants. But that's an interesting question. I don't know enough yet. But at least the more prominent ones, like Mordechai Noah and Uriah Levy, were generally associated with Democrats. Andrew Jackson is sort of the founder of the Democratic Party. It was more populist. Yeah.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, the symbol of the Democratic Party, the donkey, comes from Jackson because in political cartoons, he used to be drawn as a jackass. So that's why we have the donkey as a symbol of the Democratic Party.
Fascinating. I didn't know that. Yeah. The Andrew Jackson is such an interesting figure, very complex, murdered a lot of Native Americans, was very uncouth. You want to say, he said was not a very dignified president, but also was in some ways a great president in that he was, he was not an elitist, and he was very much appointed people to office who were not represented before, and was popular among immigrants and so forth. So complicated figure. Tyler had some prominent friendships with Jews. One of his closer friends was Jesse Seligman. Seligman ultimately, his sort of later on, become very prominent investment bankers, but he comes to the United States penniless from Germany in 1841, and they begin sort of very early investments in land and so forth, and achieves prominence, and it was kind of an advisor to Tyler. Again, Uriah Phillips Levy, he appears again. He has a relationship with Tyler, and he's promoted. In 1844, President Tyler showed his admiration for Uriah Levy by recommending to the Senate that he be promoted from lieutenant to captain. The promotion was confirmed on May 31st, 1844, although ironically, Levy's suspension from the Navy, because they hated him because he hated flogging, remained. It's just interesting. It's just kind of a lot of contradictions. So Tyler is succeeded by James K. Polk. James K. Polk, again, he did not have many Jewish associations, but one Jewish person who's actually another very interesting figure in Jewish history was a guy named David Yulee Levy. Now, has anyone here ever been to Amelia Island or Fernandina Beach in Florida? Anyone? Beautiful. If you ever want to go on a vacation, northern Florida, it's really lovely. We've been there a couple times. But I distinctly remember walking down the street, Fernandina Beach, and coming across this sculpture, and it's a sculpture of David Levy Yulee. And I said, okay, this guy, I mean, his middle name is Levy, so it's a good chance he was Jewish. And turns out, I pulled out my phone. I had never heard of him, even though I studied history. I picked up my phone, looked it up on Wikipedia. This is like 8-9 years ago. He was the first Jewish senator elected to Congress. And he was elected from Florida. And he was Jewish, although he married somebody who was from a very prominent Christian family. And she didn't like being known as Mrs. Levy. And so he changed his last name to Yulee. In fact, there's a town in Florida called Yulee, Florida, which is named after him. And he helped build the Florida Railroad, essentially the railroad that connected East and West Florida and North and South Florida, along with others, was really spearheaded by David Levy. And he raised his kids as Christian, although he himself never converted. He was very pro-slavery and ultimately left the Senate when Florida was part of the secession from the Union. Even more interestingly, he was Jewish, but his grandfather was Muslim. Now, how is that possible? His grandfather was a sultan in Morocco, and a Moroccan pirate captured Rachel Levy, who was a daughter of an English doctor, brought her back to Morocco. She became part of his harem, this Muslim sultan, got pregnant, escaped from the harem, and ultimately married a Jewish guy named Moses Elias Levy in Britain, who gave birth to David Levy's father. So his grandfather was Muslim, his wife is Christian, he's Jewish, and he's the first Jewish senator in the United States. I mean, this is fascinating history. But he and Uriah Levy hated each other. So these are two of the most prominent Jewish Americans of the time, and they hate each other. Uriah Levy is a liberal, opposes slavery. David Levy is very pro-slavery and is part of the Confederacy. And they, before the Florida secedes, the two of them had several debates in the Senate. So kind of an interesting, if you're ever in Fernandina Beach, last time I was there, we were there, must have been about a year ago. We were vacationing, and I went back to the sculpture, and I went into the, they have, like a little history building where you can pick up material and you can, I think go on tours. And I was talking with the woman sitting at the desk. And I said, that's quite an interesting sculpture. It's an interesting history. And then I asked her, I said, did you get any pushback during the time when people were taking down sculptures of the Confederacy? You know, this was, and I said, did you get any pushback with that sculpture? She said, a little bit. She said, but it dissipated very quickly. So I bet, my guess is most people don't really know his history. And it's just kind of, you know, they see David Levy Yulee, and they know that there's a town in Florida named Yulee and that he built the Florida Railroad. They don't know much about his Confederacy history or his Jewish history. So the sculpture is still there. Okay, any questions? Okay, so next is Zachary Taylor. Again, Zachary Taylor does not last long in the presidency. And he doesn't have much of a connection with Jewish life. He's only president from 1849 to 1850. He died while in office. But Jewish immigration to the United States continues to increase during this time. And perhaps the most prominent Jew in America during around 1850 was August Belmont. Belmont Stakes, you know, the big horse race that still exists. August Belmont was the builder of New York's racetrack, Belmont Park. He had changed his name because he wanted to assimilate. And he was sort of he was a banker. He was a representative of the Rothschilds, essentially, in the United States. That was his role in the 1840s and 1850s. And he wanted to be accepted among the elites. So even though he was Jewish, he didn't practice. He never denied his Jewish roots, though, you know, and he never converted to another religion, but his children were baptized, and essentially, you know, Judaism was lost in his family. This is not uncommon. This is not uncommon among Jews. And remember, we can be critical, but the Jewish population of the United States is still so small. It was very difficult to perpetuate Judaism in America. That's why so many of these early Jewish residents of America, Judaism's lost in their families because it's hard to get married. It's hard to, you know, to build a congregation. In some ways, you need community, and that really didn't exist in America really until the late 19th century. Tyler is succeeded by Millard Fillmore. Millard Fillmore is not the best president, unable to really keep peace, although Millard Fillmore is close with David Levy and also with Judah Benjamin. Judah Benjamin is another fascinating figure in American Jewish life. Judah Benjamin, born in the West Indies, like Alexander Hamilton, raised in a Sephardic Jewish family, ultimately makes his way to Charleston, South Carolina, excuse me, is brilliant, accepted at Yale, kicked out of Yale. No one knows why. There is speculation that he was kicked out because he was gay. Now, this is quite interesting because it was an altercation with another boy and nobody kept records. It wasn't a fight, but this is what many historians believe. So he's kicked out of Yale, comes back, ultimately gets his law degree, becomes an extremely successful lawyer, you know, mega wealthy, marries a woman who's Catholic, who a year after they have one daughter, and then a year after their daughter is born, his wife moves to Paris and never comes back. He stays. He visits her every year or so, but he stays, becomes a successful lawyer, buys a plantation, you know, has big slavery, involved in politics, ultimately elected to the Senate, respected senator, ultimately joins in the secession, becomes the Secretary of State of the Confederacy, and becomes Jefferson Davis's closest advisor. When the Civil War ends, he escapes. He dresses up as a woman and takes a 3-week journey in a carriage to Florida, ultimately is able to get on a boat, makes it to England, and becomes one of the most prominent lawyers in England, and writes the textbook that is still studied in Britain today. I mean, they talk about a cat with 9 lives. I mean, he is fascinating, very just, brilliant. Never lives with his wife, doesn't have any other relationships that we know about. This is why very fond of his nephew. Some speculate, nephew lived with him for a long time. Who knows? This is quite an interesting figure. There's a new biography of him that just came out a couple of years ago. I read it. I highly recommend it. He's, another issue. There's a sculpture of Judah Benjamin that was in Charlotte, North Carolina, was taken down in 2020. It's taken down. I don't remember how it got there. I think it was donated by somebody, but it was taken down. Okay. Then we get Franklin Pierce. Not much during Pierce. Again, August Belmont. The first synagogue in Washington, D.C. is built during Pierce's time. This is when, by the way, so Pierce is president from 1853 to 1857. This is when a lot of the first Reformed synagogues in the United States are built, including KAM, which is built in Chicago. Of course, it's not Kehilat Anshe Ma'arav, Congregation of the Men of the West, founded by German Jews. And this is when Washington Hebrew Congregation, which still exists, big, prominent, beautiful congregation, Washington, D.C., is built in 1856. So Pierce signed the bill that allowed this, that gave the charter to Washington Hebrew Congregation. Other interesting, he doesn't really do much with the Jewish community as president. He's followed by James Buchanan. So Buchanan, again, not much, didn't really have close relationships with the Jewish community. But interestingly, another major controversy overseas happens during Buchanan's presidency, and it's called the Mortara affair. This is quite interesting. I'll just read this to you because I want you get the details. In June 1858, papal authorities abducted 6-year-old Edgar Mortara from the home of his Jewish parents in Bologna, Italy, over which the Vatican ruled, claiming that the child had been secretly baptized at the request of a Catholic servant of the Mortaras and thus should be raised as a Catholic. The Jewish community petitioned Buchanan to intervene. Although Buchanan sympathized with the Jewish community's request, he believed it inappropriate for the United States to intervene in the internal affairs of another government, in this case, the Papal States. That President Van Buren had intervened earlier in the Damascus affair, which we talked about in 1840, did not influence Buchanan. His mind was focused on the slavery debate. It was consuming much of his time and was also weakening Democratic Party unity. As a Democrat, Buchanan did not want to divide the Democratic Party further by antagonizing Northern Irish Catholic voters who supported the papacy's position. So yeah, this was a horrible case. This was I don't know, the church may have eventually apologized for it, but essentially kidnapped a child who'd been baptized by his parents' housekeeper. Judah P. Benjamin is, of course, another still prominent during this time. But again, Buchanan's time is consumed with the upcoming Civil War. Then we get to Abraham Lincoln, who's generally ranked as the greatest president in American history. Interesting, probably a good analysis. I mean, he accomplished so much and kept the Union together. Lincoln had several contacts with Jews, not a ton. In many, it's interesting with Lincoln, you see a lot of reverence for him after his death, right? There was a very prominent Chicago federal judge named Abraham Lincoln Merovitz. You may have heard of him. His nephew was a member of our congregation, passed away a couple of years ago, James Merovitz, wonderful guy. And there were a lot of Jews who kind of named their children in some way after Abraham Lincoln. I mean, Abraham itself, not a biblical name. Lincoln's first contacts with Jews are really during his time in Springfield as an attorney. He has partners and other people that he served in the legislature with who are Jewish. One of them is named Abraham Jonas, who was a close friend of Lincoln's. There are letters from Lincoln calling Jonas one of his most valued friends. He had a relationship with a very prominent Chicago Jewish guy named Henry Greenebaum. Greenebaum family is one of the sort of earliest, kind of most prominent German Jewish families in Chicago. And Lincoln was friendly with Henry Greenebaum, who was the father, who was sort of the patriarch. He has one of the founders of KAM is a guy named Abraham Cohn, K-O-H-N. I wonder if he has probably some distant relationship with our Cohn family. I don't know if Alice is on. We should find that out. But Abraham Cohn is one of the founders of KAM, Isaiah Israel, or not KAM, it's not now Isaiah Israel. He was a very successful businessman, and he was close with Lincoln. In fact, communicated with Lincoln throughout his time in the presidency. They met frequently. In fact, upon the president's election, Cohn sent him a painted replica of the American flag that he had personally decorated and upon which he had inscribed the Hebrew words from the book of Joshua. Every place that the sole of your foot shall tread, I have given to you, as I promised to Moses. I will not fail you nor forsake you. Be strong and of good courage. Interestingly. So they had a good relationship with Lincoln. And Lincoln, okay, Alice says, not a relative as far as I know. Who knows? Who knows? It's an interesting spelling, though. He did spell it K-O-H-N, which is not as common. Okay. What else about Lincoln? So Lincoln, most Jews at that time are in the North. Now, interestingly, there are many prominent Southern Jews, as we already talked about. We know that Savannah and Charleston were major centers of Jewish life. But over the 1840s and 1850s, as Jews immigrate from Germany and Austria, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago even, other cities that are not these sort of smaller Southern cities begin to build Jewish populations. And so by the time of the Civil War, the majority of Jews live in the North. So Lincoln was fairly popular. And the majority of Jews are anti-slavery. I mean, again, yes, there were Jews who had slaves, no question. Judah Benjamin, David Levy, but the sort of thrust of Jewish life has already moved north. And so Jews generally are quite supportive of Lincoln. And there were a lot of prominent Jewish writers who really celebrated the patriotism of American Jews. And American Jews were very patriotic in many ways because America was the freest and most open country for Jews at that time, out of anywhere. And America is kind of emerging. I mean, until really, after the war, America grows even faster. But America had been emerging as a country as more people immigrated there, as agricultural production grew, trade grew. America is becoming a greater destination for immigrants, and Jews are prominent. So most American Jews supported Lincoln, and Lincoln was quite open to American Jews. Again, he keeps popping up. Uriah Phillips Levy, as I said earlier. 3 years later, when the Civil War broke out, Levy, at age 69, tried unsuccessfully to persuade the Navy secretary to send him back to sea. Levy appealed to President Lincoln, but according to unconfirmed legend, the president reminded Levy that he was a mite too old for such duty. Abraham Lincoln appointed him to the Marshall Board in Washington, D.C. Many German Jews became active in the Republican Party. In fact, I found this quite interesting. Included among the most prominent Republican Jews of that period was Moses Aaron Dropsie, Dropsie, a Philadelphia lawyer whose father was Jewish and mother Christian. At age 14, Moses favored Judaism and became a devout Jew. He would bequeath funds to establish Dropsie College for Hebrew and Cognate Learning, which essentially still exists. It was changed names a few times. Dropsie was a founder of the Republican Party in Philadelphia, which strongly supported Lincoln. Another major Lincoln supporter was a man named Louis Dembetz. Louis Dembetz. Anyone know who Louis Dembetz is the uncle of? Definitely someone you've heard of. Louis Dembetz is the uncle of Louis Brandeis. And interestingly, many people credit Louis Dembetz for Brandeis's sense of Judaism. So Louis Brandeis is born in Louisville in 1848. His parents had immigrated from, it was Prague or Vienna, one of the parts of Central Europe, and basically gave up on Judaism. He never, Brandeis was raised with no Judaism in the home, except when his uncle, Louis Dembetz, would visit. So that's his mother's brother, Louis Dembetz, who was an active member of the Jewish community in New York. And in fact, nobody knows for sure, but people say Louis Dembetz gave him a bar mitzvah, gave Louis Brandeis a bar mitzvah when he was 13. And Louis Dembetz is a very active and influential political figure. And he had an impact on Louis Brandeis's life. And he was friendly. He had a relationship with Lincoln. He had a relationship with other prominent Jews. And just like during the Revolutionary War, there were Jews who helped finance the Civil War in America. I didn't see it. My parents saw it in New York. I don't know if Rabbi Ike saw it while he was there too. There's a play about the Lehman family. And the Lehmans started off as, cotton sellers in Montgomery, Alabama, and ultimately became investment bankers. Investment banking emerged in the United States really during and after the Civil War as a way to fund the war and then ultimately to fund Reconstruction and the building of America. The Civil War ultimately led to a stronger national government and a government, Lincoln gave the first land grants for colleges in the United States. Clavey Road, which Macomb sits on, was ultimately a land grant to Mr. Clavey from Abraham Lincoln, from what I understand. So Lincoln is an important kind of figure in building up modern America. So some of the great sort of German Jewish banking houses really got their start helping finance uniforms and all kinds of other things during the Civil War. Another interesting, yes, go ahead, Sarah.
Just a family note, my father's great-grandfather, so my second great-grandfather, his name was Elias Benjamin, immigrated from Germany and served in the Civil War. And if immigrants went in the Civil War, they were given citizenship upon discharge.
Yes.
So I have his discharge papers from the Civil War. And so I thought that was an interesting family historical note. And the Benjamins eventually married the Kahns, which was spelled Kahn.
Mm-hmm.
And Kahn, to my understanding, with Kohn was a German form of Kohn, Kohn, were German forms for Cohen. Both were.
That makes sense. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Lincoln was also the first president to support Jews becoming chaplains in the army. This was not the case. During the Revolutionary War, there were no Jewish chaplains, but Lincoln supported it. And the first Jewish chaplain was the Reverend Jacob Frankel, and he served in 1862. He became the first Jewish chaplain in the U.S. Army. So that's quite interesting. Let's see. A couple other interesting things about Lincoln. Perhaps one of his most famous things, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more next week when we talk about Grant, but on December 17th, 1862, Ulysses S. Grant issued order number 11, where he said, the Jews, as a class, violating every regulation of trade established by the Treasury Department and also departmental orders, are hereby expelled from the Department of Tennessee. So that was what the territory was called, within 24 hours. With Tennessee Jews falsely accused of bribing officers to allow them to smuggle cotton, a scarce commodity, from the South to the North, Jewish businessmen strongly protested Grant's order. And ultimately, Isaac Mayer Wise and a few other prominent rabbis at the time met with Lincoln to intervene to get him to rescind Grant's order, which was done. And Grant ultimately apologized for that. And we'll talk about that a little bit more next week. Grant is kind of undergoing a rehabilitation in historians' imagination now. People are seeing him as a much better president than they used to see him. But Lincoln, of course, we know he was assassinated. And the Jewish response to his assassination was quite profound. A lot of the most prominent rabbis in the country at the time, mourned him, like Isaac Mayer Wise was a very prominent, even though, Isaac Mayer Wise is fascinating. Isaac Mayer Wise is in Cincinnati, and Cincinnati is, of course, a border. It's part of Ohio, which is sort of a border state. And just across the river from Ohio is Kentucky, which is a southern state. And so Cincinnati, if you've ever been there, it is kind of southern. It's not southern, but it's southern. And so Isaac Mayer Wise leaned towards the South, but he was not pro-slavery. He was sort of equivocal about it. But after Lincoln's assassination, this is one of the sermons that Isaac Mayer Wise gave. Isaac Mayer Wise liked to exaggerate things. Brethren, the lamented Abraham Lincoln believed himself to be bone from our bone and flesh from our flesh. He supposed himself to be the descendant of Hebrew parentage. He said so in my presence. Who knows whether that's true or not? But Isaac Mayer Wise liked to exaggerate. In fact, Isaac Mayer Wise, there's a lot of speculation that he was never really ordained as a rabbi. Whenever people would ask him about where he did his rabbinic training, he would kind of change the subject. So it wouldn't be surprised if he kind of made that up. Yeah.
Now, Kentucky was part of the Union, and that
Yes.
may have been a legacy of Henry Clay. But
Right.
I believe it, even though it's a southern state, it was technically in the Union. And Lincoln, when he freed the slaves,
Yes.
he did not free the slaves in the northern border states.
Yes.
And when he was told he was a hypocrite, his response was, I can't win the war without Kentucky.
Right. Yes. This is quite, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's quite an interesting moral dilemma. And you think about that. You think about, strategy. He didn't want to alienate those states that didn't secede, but also had slavery. I think about, Franklin Roosevelt and the Holocaust. And he, would say, why didn't you bomb the tracks, leading to Auschwitz and other death camps? You'd say, well, I'm focused on winning the war. Now, whether that was just an excuse or whether it was a legitimate strategy, who knows? But it is in many ways, when you're a president, you have to make these compromises that upset a lot of people. And I think that's one of them.
The way Roosevelt handled things, though, is that he would have his wife go do and say the things that he couldn't do. And they would say, well, I can't control the missus.
Yeah.
But they were allies in what she went and did. He knew what she was doing.
Fascinating. Well, we'll get to Roosevelt. Roosevelt just to give you, Roosevelt is really, Lincoln was a Republican and Jews generally supported Lincoln. And Jews were basically supporters of the Republican Party up until Roosevelt. Vast majority of Jews, in local elections, like in New York, Tammany Hall controlled things and it was generally, Democrat. But in general, Jews tended to associate freedom with the Republican Party, and Democrats were associated with kind of populism and anti-immigrant sentiment. It was not until Roosevelt that Jews shifted, and that's because Roosevelt was seen as a bulwark against anti-Semitism and against the Depression. And as we'll talk about in a couple of weeks, anti-Semitism increases substantially during times of economic depression, and Roosevelt was seen as a way out of that. So again, it's so great seeing all of you. We covered some good ground today, and we'll get back together again next week when we talk about Andrew Johnson and Forward and Ulysses S. Grant and a couple others. Andrew Johnson, not much to say there, one of the worst presidents in American history, but we will get to all of that next week. See you then.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.